I like to stand when I'm going to talk.
Okay, you want to stand up here
I was
or
going
not?
to stand down there.
Okay,
That's fine. Stand down.
that's fine.
Okay.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is George Collins. I had to do that because I know you have not seen me for a long, long time. The occasion of my return to this wonderful group has been one that I wish had never occurred. You know, from time to time, a comet streaks across our skies, our lives, and it's brief, it sparkles, it brings everything to life and leaves us in wonderment, awe, and gratitude. And such we have with the departure of our dear friend Lindy Davies. This afternoon is a special opportunity for us to remember, give thanks in whatever way you do, and to fortify ourselves in the knowledge that he has left us some valuable things, some valuable foundations on which to build, to continue, to reach further than we would have gone had he not been here. We're very pleased to have his widow, Lisa Cooley Davies, and I invite you to give her the warmest reception that you can. All of you, I'm sure, have things to say about Lindy and to Lisa, and you will have that opportunity. To begin, the person who made it possible, or at least set the spark of the comet, will tell you something about that beginning and some of what occurred during the past, during the travel of that streak across our world. Mike Curtis.
Good afternoon. Lindy has been my close friend and colleague for 30 years now. I have had to stop and think how long it's been. I met him in the mid-'80s, and we were arborists. And we had a little status because the trees we were working on were some of the tallest trees in the area, over 150 feet tall. Lindy was part of a crew that came into Winterthur Gardens where I worked and helped me catch up on the safety pruning over the azalea woods. And when these guys sat down for lunch at the picnic table without any invitation or forewarning, I whipped out my Henry George charts and started giving them the fundamental economics class. I happen to remember there was one guy there, and his father was named Henry George, but he had no idea who our Henry George was. Well, certainly Lindy, more than the others, grasped the concepts and seemed to really accept the ideas and the philosophy. And then they were gone, and I never gave another thought until I had heard that Lindy had a really serious accident in the tree, and his tree climbing days were over. And he went back to the university and pursued a master's degree in education and English literature. And I had pretty much forgotten about his interest in Henry George when I got a phone call and he said, Mike, can you come down? I'm required to teach English to get my degree here, and they're supposed to do some argumentative writing, and I'd like you to come and give them a little presentation on Henry George. That would be fun, sure. You buy me lunch? Yeah, yeah. So I did it a couple of times for a couple different classes, and then he did it himself, and before you know it, I had him going and doing a weekly seminar at the Prison Work Release Center where I had done it for years. Well, about a year or so later, he got his master's degree, and George Collins got promoted to the director of the Henry George School in New York, and Lindy and I both went to work for George, setting up the Sesquicentennial Conference in Philadelphia, the 150th anniversary of Henry George's birth. And when that conference was over, Lindy was off to New York. And at the same time, of course, Bob Clancy had the Henry George Institute in the same building, and they became friends. And about a year later, we had another conference up in Easton, Pennsylvania, at the Lafayette College. And after the conference, Lindy and I went on a little trip out to see three of his correspondence students with the Henry George Institute. And let's see what their names were. Tommy Lyons, Tony Drayton Lloyd, and the famous or infamous Mumia Abu Jamal. And all three of them became correspondence teachers. And of course, Jamal was pretty famous, but it turns out he had more correspondence students with the Henry George Institute than any other volunteer teacher. Well, about the time that Bob Clancy died, Lindy took over the Institute, and he and Lisa moved to Maine. And that was Lindy's job then, to run the Institute. And to the courses that were going through the regular mail, Lindy added a website and internet correspondence courses. He even reformatted the website rather recently so that people could take the courses with their smartphones. He took the George's Journal from typewritten and mimeographed to the first class glazed pages and wonderful colored pictures that we know it today. In 2000, I worked with Lindy and Sadie and Rodney, and we put on what we thought was a really good educational conference that followed the CGO conference there in Arden. And after that, Lindy worked quite often, and I think every year, with the CGO in preparation and in administering the conferences. And on several occasions, Lindy added an educational component to the conferences. He wrote the Alodia Scrapbook. You probably remember that, where the African nation repudiates its foreign debt and adopts the single tax. And if you remember, delightfully, some of the characters, many of the characters in the book were had similar names to prominent Georgists. As you know, the Science of Political Economy was published as an unfinished manuscript. And Lindy decided that he should boil it down to a readable and quite workable, and what I think is a superior product, and I believe Henry George would have been very pleased with it. He made an enormous investment in time and energy, and he solicited the help of Doctors Fetter and Foldberry in getting the Institute certified with College Credit Recommendation Service. 3 college credits for 3 Henry George courses in Principles of Political Economy. College credit was being talked about when I came into the movement 50 years ago. I'm sure they were talking about it long before that, and that's why I think it was a really big deal that he got the College Credit Recommendation Service. He gave us the Mason Gaffney Reader, with insights from Mason Gaffney that I think many of us would never have read if it hadn't been put in this wonderful book. I know he did a lot of projects for Schachenbach. He traveled to New York many times and did a series of videos explaining fundamental economics and they're on the Henry George Institute website now. We learned yesterday that he wrote, or at least worked on the book, Rent for Public Revenue. And his latest book, Understanding Economics to Fix What's Wrong, is a masterful presentation of Henry George economics with neoclassical considerations. So, for those who went to college and took macro and microeconomics, he presents the thesis of Henry George in such a way as to address the assertions of modern-day economists. And after the last 25 years, or for the last 25 years, I've talked to him probably every week or two on the phone, and we argued about the finer points, and at the conferences we've hung out together. Missed him at breakfast the last 2 days. And of course we gossiped a little bit about who was forwarding the action and who we thought wasn't forwarding the action. And I have to admit that
me.
And I've thought for a long time now that perhaps my claim to fame just might be that I was the one who brought Lindy Davies into this acquaintance with Henry George. I might even add that I would often write articles for his journal, and of course he would totally rewrite it and give me full credit for his wonderful writing. Well, at the end of this conference, I should say that I got a lot of inquiries that Lisa gave me that were sitting there at the house, and I sent them all a letter, would you like to take the course? And I now have 21 students actively engaged in the correspondence course with prisoners, and one of them is up to lesson 8, so that's pretty good since April. And when the conference is over on Monday, I'm going to go down to the federal prison in Hazleton, West Virginia, and I'm going to do a seminar and pass out some diplomas for those who have completed the course. I have to conclude by saying I do miss him dearly. Thank you.
In thinking about Lindy, I wanted to come up with some phrase. You see someone, you deal with someone, and you get some sense of who is this person? What little phrase, little gem describes them to you? And to me, Lindy was the genial combatant. You remember him. He'd go bouncing down the street as if he were someone who had no care in the world. That's what he seemed like to me. But looking back, 1989 would seem to have been a transformative year in the George's world. There was still a large audience around the world eager to meet in Philadelphia and honor the memory of Henry George on his 150th anniversary of his birth. Now, although the New York Henry George School was by then no longer the organizer of George's conferences, this international gathering was hosted by the Philadelphia Extension, rededicating the restored Henry George birthplace to its 1839 appointments. His granddaughter, the renowned choreographer Agnes DeMille, was our honored keynoter. It is important and maybe significant to you at this point to note that after many, many years of determined effort and expense devoted to rescuing that little building from private possession and its establishment as a National Historic Landmark honoring Henry George, an effort that began right here in Pittsburgh when the Henry George Foundation purchased it in 1926 to restore it or preserve it as a place of honor for Henry George, that unhappily it has become once again the private possession of a non-Georgist. That has just happened, what, a couple of years now. But other things happened that year. Now let's see what. Well, I moved on to New York to take up duties there. Not very important. And Mike Curtis brought his inestimable energy and talent to the birthplace. Well, that's something. But then we get to the real crux of the matter, the meat of the story. Lindy Davies became a professional Georgist. 1989. He became the assistant to the director of the Henry George School in New York. Now, Lindy preceded me to New York. And when I got there, he had already become well attuned to the staff and the workflow and had made the acquaintance of Bob Clancy. Now, I considered myself a reasonably good student of Clancy's, and he trusted me. We had discussed the future of the Institute and agreed that if and when the time came, I would bring the correspondence course operation back to the school where it had been such a prominent part of the curriculum. That's what started this institute. Clancy, as the head of the Henry George School in New York, had a robust program. Correspondence course in several languages, students all over. And it was thrown out when he was thrown out, to put it mildly. Well, when the time did come, now quite apart from everything else that was taking place at the school that made what he and I had agreed upon inopportune, Lindy had become so enmeshed with Clancy's process, methods, and vision that there was no question in anyone's mind but that the Institute should remain independent and that Lindy should lead it. Now, the image of the protege sitting at the feet of the mentor does not sufficiently illustrate Lindy's capture of Clancy's ethos with regard to the Institute. It was as if he had crawled into Clancy's brain and found there an analog to his own perception of what the Institute could and should be. And not that they were anything alike. Clancy was contemplative, deliberate, methodical. Lindy was jocular, expansive, innovative. But what they did have in common was a keen mind and the unflagging conviction that the Georgist reform is central, is indispensable to the creation and existence of a just society. Now, things like changes in name and partial acceptance or concessions for the sake of comity with others on the part of Georgist organizations, they both believed would only corrode and fragment the necessary reform. Now, the Henry George School was a small shop, each staff member having to undertake multiple tasks. Classroom courses were our mainstay, and ancillary programs on Fridays and Saturdays. Our hours were unorthodox, but whatever came our way, whatever promised to provide added enrichment to the task of making George known and relevant, Lindy was up for. An area that needed constant nurture and attention was alumni involvement. The study and critique of New York City assessment practices that he began as an alumni project remained a major enterprise for Lindy all the years after he left the school. Now, Lindy and I worked well together, and the achievements of the New York School, 1989 to 1998, was but a prelude to what he accomplished with the Institute. And a special thanks is due to Mike for laying before us what are just the bare bones of what that magnificent accomplishment has been. Now, our friendship was a warm one and did not diminish when he left for Maine and I for other climes. His son and my grandson were born in the same year, and we often compared notes on their progress. Institute business filled the gaps. Now, the circumstances under which I left the school were dispiriting. Lindy saw it all in the making, and the moment the opportunity arose, he did what only the sweetest soul would do. He composed the most laudatory tribute, commending me for my 30 years of work in the Georgist movement. Had it signed by 36 participants attending the conference in 1998, which included some of you present here. Among all the superlatives that are in it is one accolade that only Lindy would think to include. He described me as a sparkled-eyed grandpa. And as well, a cherished friend. Now, it is to me, that tribute, a prized possession from a dearly loved friend to whom it tears at the heart to say goodbye. Well, another person who had so much to do with Lindy and who's got things to do and things to say and things to convey about him is Mark Sullivan.
It's really an honor, and I'm very grateful to be able to say a few words about Lindy. And I have actually a message from a friend of Lindy's in my bag, so I'll trot that out in a minute. I handed out a piece that I wrote about a month ago. It really was on the occasion of the Robert Schalkenbeck Foundation annual meeting. And I was being celebrated on the occasion of my retirement, but we also, knew that Lindy had passed on. So there was a little sadness to that celebration. So I did write a little piece about Bob and Lindy, because it's impossible to think of Lindy without thinking of Bob. And this kind of follows on a little bit with what George said. I won't quote the whole thing, but I do want to quote the paragraph that it concludes with. Before I left for RSF, Lindy Davies was on staff at HGS. I think he actually started in '87. And with George Collins as executive director, Bob Clancy, George, and Lindy were an excellent, hardcore George's presence. Lindy worked directly with Bob on HGI, and Bob groomed Lindy to be his successor. It worked. As Mike Curtis and I have said, it seemed as if Lindy was channeling Bob's spirit ever since he accepted the mantle and responsibility of managing HGI. Lindy remained completely faithful to Bob's, quote, orthodox Georgist, unquote, vision and understanding of HGI's message and mission, even as he made innovations that kept HGI up to date in a social and political world driven by rapid change in communication technology. And again, I'll conclude, today is a good day to remember both and honor both Bob Clancy and Lindy Davies, two advocates of association in equality, who, like Henry George and Oscar Geiger, who was Bob's mentor, they both heard the muster roll be called, as George concludes, Progress and Poverty. I met Lindy one evening. He arrived in New York. He must have had the job, I'm not sure, or maybe he was applying for the job at the school. But we immediately realized that we were kindred spirits. We became close friends. At the school, I was editing the Henry George newsletter, and Lindy was doing a lot of the technical graphics. So we collaborated on that, and we bickered. We bickered a lot, and we used to joke about it, but it was a creative bickering. The newsletter and other projects that we were to collaborate on were always better because we bickered. And we were both pretty stubborn, so it really were, often we were butting heads about how to do something or what to say, etc. Lindy was personally expressed frustration dealing with Georgia's boards and bureaucracies. Of course, here I was one of the few paid bureaucrats of the movement. So I was very sympathetic, but I often would point out the bureaucratic or administrative necessities that he always complained about. So, but Lindy, you kind of have to blah, go through the hoops, etc. We had a lot of inside jokes. I remember one document that we wrote together made fun of me, and after I left to go to RSF and Lindy was leaving, one of the board members, Jack Schwartzman, who is a friend, found this document and was appalled. And it's like, how do we tell him that we actually cooked this up together? I don't know that we ever did, actually. Jack was filled with righteous indignation that anybody would make fun of me. One of our little jokes was the Committee for Universal Land Tenure and the Single Tax. Now, if you spell single tax with a capital S, a capital E, and a capital X, of course you get sex. So, Committee for Universal Land Tenure and the Single Tax, as an acronym, was called SEX. And I think he used that in at least one issue of the George's Journal as a kind of a humorous joke. Because we were always commenting on, well, the outside world thinks we're a cult. You know, so we were playing off on, well, let's do the cult thing. And of course, cults were known for sexual impropriety, so we had cult sex. I forget which issue of the George's Journal that showed up in. So Lindy and I had really good conversations, lots of humor. I was probably one of the first people to know that he was battling cancer. And at that point, he didn't really want the news spread. And he was such an optimist. And I realized I did not want to give him any advice on how to handle it. Because if my advice failed, then it would have been sort of my fault. He went through the chemo and the radiation. And the last time I saw him, he was visiting New York and visiting his dear friend, Sonny Rivera. Now, he had met Sonny at the Village Gate around the same time he came to New York, because Lindy was really big on jazz. And in I was already at RSF in 96. But we were looking for a part-time staff person, and he introduced Sonny to Susan Klingelhofer, and Susan hired him. And Sonny stayed with the foundation, about 15 years, I think, till about 2008. And they were, I think, very, very close. I don't know if Lisa would corroborate that, but they were really close. They used to go out to jazz clubs together, etc. And I called Sonny this morning. She lives in the Bronx now. And I said, if I give you a call between about 3 and 4, will you say a few words about Lindy? And she said, yes. So I'm going to do that right now. Many of you probably know Sonny, or have met him. So let's do this.
Will it plug into this?
Hi, Sonny. This is Mark in Pittsburgh. Hold on a second, because we're going to plug you in, so to speak.
Does it take this kind of a jack?
I don't know.
Yeah, probably will.
No, it doesn't.
All right, I'm going to
Hold it up to the mic.
hold the phone up to the mic. Pardon?
Yes,
Lisa
hi,
is
Sonny.
Lisa's right on the stage behind me,
Oh, okay.
and Mike and George, and I'm looking at a sea of some 40 or so faces. Yeah, so
Okay.
why don't you say just a few words about Lindy?
Okay. When?
Now,
Now? The sentence?
right?
No?
Yes, just start talking.
Okay. I met Lindy at the Village Gate where I worked. He walked in one day and I immediately felt a connection with this good man. He was a good friend to me for many years and he made me a better person. I loved him, I loved his family, and I miss him terribly. This planet is very, very lonely for me without Lindy Davies in it. Well, everyone consider yourself kissed on the forehead.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Miss all of you. Bye.
Hi,
Bye.
Sonny.
That was Sonny. If you know Sonny, you know who was speaking, and if you didn't, you
It's your loss.
exactly. She was quite a personality, working in the Village Gate, she met all sorts of famous people, and sometimes now infamous people. Bill Cosby was one of them. They knew each other quite well. But nothing ever happened. Although Bill Cosby did hit on her. That I know. And, but Sonny did not go for the bait. Anyway, I don't know what I did. I'll just convey the wishes of Dr. Kai Hayner, who's in Germany now. And I asked him, I said I'd convey a message from him at the memorial. And he sent me a short message really praising Lindy's talents, genius, his dedication as a Georgist. Lindy, I think there was a little overlap. George can correct me. I think George left the school. When Kai came on, was Lindy still in New York?
No.
All right, so Lindy had already gone on. But there was a strong connection between the two of them as well, because Kai was really carrying on in the Clancy, Collins.
Kai had been a student and teacher while Lindy was there.
Mark, Kai, when I took over from George, Kai helped Lindy with some of the high school things that Lindy was doing. So they did
Okay.
work together after when Lindy was in Maine and I was running the school.
Okay, yeah, so I'm sorry Kai is now in Germany and is not here with us, but he did send his greetings. Now, I think I covered all my points. Oh, occasionally, I would often argue George's theory with Lindy. He was the upholder of orthodoxy. I always styled myself a bit of a heretic. But he would usually win the argument. Whether it was about population or some of the peripheral issues, money. The only way to end the argument was for me to concede. So I often would.
And I would say I had a broken leg.
Oh, right, yes, when Lisa wanted to get me off the phone with Lindy, the code word was Lisa told Lindy she broke her leg. You broke your leg quite frequently.
Many times.
So I'm going to miss Lindy so much. I love the man. We were close enough in age to be colleagues. And, so I handed out a couple of things for you to read, but handed out the lyrics to Under Pressure by David Bowie and Queen. To me, it's always been a kind of a Georgist song. And for me, it captures Lindy's concerns. Lindy really was concerned with the homeless issue in New York City, gentrification, and really how it was impacting minority communities. Lindy, although he was amazingly intelligent, was also, I think, equally coming from the heart. And that's why I would like to play this in tribute to Push the Button, Dan. If you don't watch the images, you can read the lyrics. The images may or may not speak to you, but I think the lyrics will. I tear up with that song and linking it to Lindy. It was popular, or came out sometime in the 80s, around the time that I first met Lindy. And Lindy's birthday was October 9th. He was born on the same day, not date, as John Lennon, another famous rock star. We both appreciated the music of John Lennon and the other Beatles. Music was another thing that I think Lindy was very much into. And some of you have seen his novel that he finally wrote, and maybe Lisa will tell us about that. I'll just say the last time I saw Lindy was when he came to New York in November or December, and he wanted to visit Sonny, and I said I would join them. I took the day off. It was raining terribly, and all across town Bronx buses were crowded because everyone was running in from the rain. So I walked across the Bronx and got to Sonny's and soaking wet and basically hung out. And at that point, Lindy was undergoing probably his radiation, but he was totally bald. His hair had all fallen out, and I was alarmed, but I kept up a smiling face, and it was good that the three of us got together. Lindy always said he was going to come to New York in the winter, like February or March, and have an HDI meeting, and he was going to show me and Vadra Minter, who's the webmaster at RSF, how he does the Georges Journal. That meeting never took place because Lindy never made it back to New York. So anyway, thank you for listening, and I'll turn it back over to George, I think, and just to say that I admired Lindy greatly and loved him even more. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Lisa Cooley Davies.
This is going to be very mixed up. Trying to come up with what to say has been a challenge. Thanks. I think that Lindy was a lot of different things in his life, but there were two things that he was mostly. And I think you can guess what those two things could be. You put a husband, father as in one category. He was about family. And there was the other thing that he was, which was he was a raging Georgist. And I think the thing that we had in common was that we were passionately dedicated to the things that we were passionately dedicated to. For me, for a long time, it was public education, and for him it was Henry George, and we'd always talk about the similarities of trying to explain something that people believed they already understood. And say, well, no, you don't really understand it. Let me tell you why. And that's a really hard thing to do. So we were always trying to figure out how to do that. In the 25 years of being married to a Georgist, that's 25 conferences, of which I went to maybe 3. He didn't let me go. He didn't, especially not with the kids, and the kids were small. He didn't want to be distracted by family. And I think that he liked just being by himself with you guys. 25 years of efforts, of projects, of initiatives, and contact with all the Georgists is something you need to know. And that is that I know everything. I know who's been naughty and who's been nice. Because he would come back from the conferences and I would make him tell me everything. And he always came back pretty happy. He always came back very charged up and very, ready to tackle things. And It was work that made him happy. It was work that made him happy. It was his kids, it was me, and it was work, and it was all these things together, and the life that we constructed together was a life in which we could have all those things. And even though the reason that he left New York, well, he left New York not being in line to become the next director of the Henry George School because of the circumstances of the school at the time, but we didn't regret it because we were able to have that integration of family life and our work. In New York, you can't be poor, but in Maine you can. So we were able to do what we wanted. And boy, the debt year after year piled up. You want to do Henry George and be an education reformer, you're not going to make a lot of money. We have seen over a few years, it seems like the Georgist movement is taken over by the dark side. And it comes in waves, and it seems like the folks at the Henry George Institute, I like to think of them as the Jedi, the people who are continuing to work toward genuine Georgist change and helping these principles be part of the discussion, be a factor in when we talk about the change that needs to take place. The Georgist movement, however, was a source of great frustration for Lindy, as I'm sure it is for many, that the sort of pushing against those with power and money, but no real commitment to the principles of Henry George. That was a source of great frustration, just as Henry George was a source of hope and of excitement for Lindy. But his work and his community were hugely fulfilling for him. And he kept on going because he kept on wanting to work that, to do what he was doing and to work with other people. In my own loss, since April, I have had to find personally new ways to live, to find my own purpose, to find meaning. When you're married and you are on the same pathway, and there is meaning in simply being with another person, and when you lose that, you sort of have to float around and find out what's the reason to get up in the morning. Lindy made me happy every day. So when I live now, I fix things that I never noticed before, and I create new things for myself, for my comfort, in my everyday, to help me continue living the life that we were living together. Now, your loss is as great as mine, and for those of us who want to see the single tax become a larger factor in the world and a topic for public discussion and a promise for future generations, the loss of Lindy is even greater. And it's hard to think about how we can make up for that loss. It's going to be a huge job. And I think that to do it, we need to learn from who Lindy was and to dig deep. And of course, he was about educating, finding people to educate, attracting people who would be interested in this kind of change. Teach. Find out how to teach. Fulfill his vision, but add your own creativity, sort of what I'm doing with my life. Add your own ways of teaching and discussing in both small and large efforts. Teach these principles. There's a lot of resources out there to use to keep teaching, especially at the HGI, the books, the courses, the videos. He was the voice for Georgist education, and there was a reason for that. It's not that he didn't think the work on bringing the two-rate tax to various locations was important. He did think it was important, but he said you can't do that without having people understand this sort of counterintuitive way of looking at economic reform. At least to most people, it seems counterintuitive. So I guess my hope is that every part of George's effort will be involved somehow in teaching. But mostly what I want, the message I want to give is to learn from who Lindy was, and this is where I'm going to start crying. He was generous, so be generous. He was kind. He was sensible. He was optimistic, but he worked really hard. You can't be optimistic about the future and not really work hard to try to get there. Love the people you love. Make sure they know how you feel all the time. Get a 70s haircut. Roll up your sleeves. I have a collection of shirts that I found laying around the bottom of the closet, the sleeves rolled up, and I've saved them. I can't unroll those sleeves. Find a way toward justice, because that's what he felt the Henry George change would bring, is justice toward a fairer future. And while doing that, enjoy and appreciate life right now. I think that would be his wish for everybody, for all of us here. Thank you. One more thing. Lindy loved music, as people have been saying, and what he regarded as the anthem of Henry George, of his movement, was a song called "Harvest for the World" by the Isley Brothers. And I'll read you the lyrics. Old babies together, everyone a seed. Half of us are satisfied, half of us in need. Love's bountiful in us, tarnished by our greed. When will there be a harvest for the world? And that was he liked that because it sort of looked at land and the value of land as being something that could raise up everybody. A nation planted, so concerned with gain. As the seasons come and go, greater grows the pain, and far too many feeling the strain. When will there be a harvest for the world? Gather every man, gather every woman, celebrate your lives, give thanks for your children. Overlooking none, hoping life gets better for the world. Dress me up for battle when all I want is peace. Those of us who pay the price come home with the least. Nation after nation turning into beast. When will there be a harvest for the world? Thank you.
And I'm sure that many of you have things that you wish to say. The floor is yours.
Not yet, but I will.
He's gonna get the mic.
The mic will come around.
Who has some?
Easy?
I have some. Lisa, thank you.
There's
The
a
bottom.
button on the bottom.
No, that's. Thank you very much.
No.
But
It should be green.
Lindy, Lindy was three things, and perhaps the most important one that
I still don't think it's on.
It's it. They gotta turn it up.
hello.
Yeah.
Come up to the.
It's on now.
Do you have another one?
Why don't you come here?
Do you have another one?
George,
Lindy was three things at least.
Hold it,
And
hold on.
perhaps the most
Wait.
important
Wait
was
till
he
we
was
get
a
the mic
teacher.
working.
Just step
You know,
up
they
There you
notice
go.
Try this one.
The Sphinx
There you go.
is still standing after a couple thousand years, but I don't know anything about who designed it or who wrote it. It doesn't really matter. But Lindy was a teacher, and teachers live on forever, I think. They're, through their thoughts and the thoughts of their students, it goes on and on for all time. And people like Lindy never die. They're in the world forever, and we are grateful for their having been here.
Thank you. There was a friend of my family was there, and she said that she visited her daughter in Australia, and because she knew Lindy, she saw that there was a meeting of some Henry George group, and she attended, and she sat down, and she became a celebrity very quickly because she said that she knew Lindy Davies.
All right.
So she reminded us that his writings are still out there, and because of technology, they're all around the world, so it's a nice thing to think about. Very briefly. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. Lindy was the master of the well-chosen word. That he seemed to always be able to find the thing to say that would bring somebody who really was coming from some opposing place into understanding what we were about. And he just always seemed to find the right words, and it was just such a pleasure to be in his presence. That piece will stick with me forever.
Lindy, his well-chosen, I was thinking, sometimes I would be thinking, no, that's wrong, damn it. And if I translated that into Lindy speak, it would be, well, shucks, golly. And he just had a very disarming way of saying things. And he did love to, one of the things he often wanted to do was debate. And he would ask me, we had several debates at George's conferences that they were all his idea. And he would want to debate, and he would want to debate me because I held the opposite view, and he thought I would give it the best. He didn't want to debate somebody he could defeat easily, so he would debate me on whether the money issue was comparable in importance to the land issue, or there were several different things, and he loved those debates because we always came out appreciating something we didn't appreciate before. And he especially would come out of a debate and say, that he loved that debate because he learned something in that debate. And in this world of politics where everybody's about winning, his idea of a good debate was where he got really, really challenged and had to think really hard and ended up adjusting his perceptions, not necessarily agreeing with the other side, but just seeing that there was much more depth in these questions than he started out with, and that was like a really valuable thing to him.
I'll add to that he often told me that he admired that Mike Curtis's method of never contradicting a student, never saying, you got that wrong, never. He would manage somehow to point out what was correct, completely circumnavigating the whole issue that what you just said was wrong. And he really admired that, and I think he tried to do that himself. As a Suzuki violin teacher, it's very much like what we do as well. Don't make the student be wrong. Figure it out.
Mike, if you could teach me that trick, I would appreciate it.
But I don't want to make you wrong.
I represent Mr. Max Schmo.
Oh.
Max, if I wanted Lindy and he wasn't responding, I'd write, Dear Max. And it was sort of funny. I thought of Max on the 18th of January. And for those of you who know, that was the day Scott lost his mom. And I lost a mother-in-law who was sort of a Georgist. She had to be, because she had to listen to her son and her daughter-in-law talk about Henry. And to the point when my father-in-law had prostate cancer and we weren't concerned. Why? Sam Ventrell had it and it was nothing. So, Dad, it's nothing. But Lindy and I used to collaborate on a lot of things in terms of the team CGO. And the one thing that you guys never saw was the rubber duckies. Here's a family of rubber duckies. And because I didn't have my muse with me, I couldn't collaborate. So the money that would have been spent on Team CGO's funky things that we went on for a good 25 years goes to you, because you need it. I thank you for sharing your husband. I heard about the broken leg many a time, and she needed it. There are other little things when my spouse would say, "What are you doing now?" and he'd give me the thing. So, no, thank you for sharing, and thank you for being our friend. I hope you come again. You are most welcome.
I need to be standing.
My name's Bill Batt, and I didn't expect to
Is that on?
want
Yeah, it's
Okay.
Sorry, no.
I didn't expect to stand up and say anything, but I've been coming to George's conferences since 1993. And Lindy was always among us. And what struck me as being part of several of the Georgist organizations and among its leaders in some, is that Lindy was always there to cooperate with every one of them, whether it was the CGO, the CSE, the Schalkenbach board, the, I can't think of others, HDI, of course, was his own, but there were any number of organizations, most of them, one or two people, but he was there to help with whatever was necessary with whoever needed it. That was extremely important given our rather fragmented movement.
I was asked to send our condolences from Canada and from the UK. First, Canada. The Henry George Foundation of Canada really misses Lindy, and lots been said about him. Frank Leon, John Fisher, Sue's here, Frank Pedal, Eric, many more. So please accept our condolences and sympathy. We'll keep you in our prayers, and we'll try to do the work that Lindy would feel good for. I was talking to David Triggs just last week, and I know David would agree with this, both the IU and the Henry George Foundation of Great Britain, because Lindy did go there to a conference, you know. They were really saddened, and they sent their condolences as well. And they'll keep you in their prayers, and they'll carry on the work that Lindy started. Thank you.
We've always had a fantasy of going to London for a couple of years to do something for Henry George, just to be in London. We both wanted to be in London, figure out how to be there and do something.
Hi, I'm Josh, and it's not on yet. It's green. Yeah, it is green. It's on. I'd just like to relate that we've seen Lindy at these conferences, of course, but in the wild and on the ground, Lindy was a terrific ally of the center, because we always wished, once we got to know each other, that the education wings of the the Georgists and the actual implementarians and activists would at last work together in two wings to make a one bird. And outside of our circle, I don't know if anybody knows this, but Lindy and I used to troop around New York City in the past 10 years giving instruction on the practicalities and the theory to groups like the New York Federal Reserve. We had a panel where Lindy and I and Matt Stillman, who some of you may know, would talk to some of the biggest urban economists in the East Coast. Bob Inman, for example, of the University of Pennsylvania. He was not intimidated in the least, which is, I think, a real statement to a real inner backbone of steel. And Lindy and I visited and talked to and got interest that is still ongoing in the city of New York with City Controller Scott Stringer. And I think that he impressed. In fact, he became the Georgist mole inside the Independent Budget Office of New York City. They always picked up the phone for him, and there was always an economist that was assigned to Lindy. And I bet people don't know that, but he worked very hard to not just educate the world, but to also educate those that really control the hands of power. And I'm very grateful for our association. Thanks.
The first time I met him was, I attended one of these conferences, and Lindy had just joined us. And I thought, what a marvelous brain to add to our movement. Very, very highly intelligent person. A couple of sessions ago, he and I, we roomed together for those 4 or 5 days. And when we left the room, he left some money for the roommate.
I also have been coming to these events for well over 30 years. Lindy was always a presence. He was bigger than life. He never, ever had a cross word to say about anybody or anything. He always looked on the sunny side of life.
You didn't room with him.
We got along fine.
Fortunately, he kept those indoors. But when he was in public, he spoke well. It was only just recently that I learned that he had a degree in literature. I always wondered why he was his English was so perfect. He could always turn a phrase. He always came up with the right word. And that is because he was both an educator and a writer. I only found that out somewhat recently. But Lindy was a man that we could all emulate. He was a gentleman in every sense, and he was a friend to all of us, and we'll all miss him. I'll miss him.
Jeff Grauber. Even though Lindy and I often disagreed on Georgia's politics, it was always a pleasure to talk to him. But what I want to say is that I had the pleasure of reviewing his novel, Sassafras Crossing, and it's just a beautiful book. It's about semi-autobiographical, so it's sort of Lindy growing up in Maryland, and I really recommend it. And I'm sure that buying the book will also help out Lisa.
Okay.
I don't remember when I met Lindy. I think we must have corresponded since I was I was making annual small contributions to HGI back when Bob Clancy was running it. That was just correspondence. So I must have corresponded with Lindy before my first Georgist conference, which was in '99. There's a lot to say about him. Other people have been saying it or much of it better. I do remember I wrote a couple of pieces for progress.org or wherever they were being published that he edited, turned my more academic English into something clear that people who are not hardcore Georgists already could understand. That's something we should remember him for. Well, we knew each other as people have said. He was affable. He didn't snarl at people. Not the way I can be sometimes. And eventually, he and others made me the president of Henry George Institute. I can't say that I was worthy of it. He was always so polite and grateful for whatever contributions I could make, money or in tutoring. I got to do more work to get things done, as well as writing checks. That's no great credit to me. I've inherited money now, but yeah, so much to remember about him.
I'm Irene. My leader is Chuck McDowell's in Chicago, but when I first started coming to conferences, I remember meeting Lindy at the morning mic, and I made such an effort to get up every morning at the morning mic, and he said, say something. So I proposed a Henry George flag, which we're still working on. But he was a gentleman and a kind person, and what I liked best about his George's Journal was the issue that showed a picture of the scale, land on one side, and the other side said everything else. That was Lindy, and he was just a real inspiration. And Sly said it best, get up, dance to the music. Thank you, Lindy.
Yeah, I'm Polly Cleveland. I think I met Lindy, must have been about 93. I worked with him on the first P&P abridged, at least I was going over the manuscript with him. And he designed this amazing cover. And I've sort of either talked with him, worked with him, supported some of his work over the years since. Most recently, he was working on the land value map of New York City, but it was also a project he would identify particular buildings that were egregiously small and run down for the location. I mean, he did some wonderful presentations on that. And we were, sort of going back and forth, how's the project going, and then it just sort of disappeared. And I'm hoping that one way or another, I and other people can pick up on that project before it totally disappears. But it was such a pleasure to work with him, and I wondered how he did it. He was doing so many other things simultaneously. He was just absolutely astonishing how many things he could do at once. And I'll really miss him too.
Hi, my name is Alan. I'm from San Diego, and there's many things I appreciate about Lindy. One time I called him and I said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I hope I'm not troubling you." And he says, "No, I'm honored." So such a gentleman. And the other thing that I really appreciate about Lindy is that they say that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And in a group of organizations that seems to prefer the 1,000 words, it was really refreshing that Lindy not only embraced graphics and art, but he really had a talent for putting things together, and you see that in the covers of the Georges Journal. There's quite a legacy in the graphics that Lindy created. And there's one other thing that I appreciated that I don't know if very many people know this about him, and that is that he was a fencer. And I just found out last year that he was a fencer, and which I am as well. And I said, well, Lindy, we got to fence sometime. He said, well, I'm not feeling too well right now, maybe next year. So I guess I have to fence with him in heaven, if I get there.
What was your weapon? What was your weapon?
I just fenced epee, and I hesitate to say this because it's going to make me sound real grander than I am, but I qualified for the national championships.
Wow.
And I fenced this year for the first time.
Fencing meant a lot to Lindy, partly because he did it with my son, partly because it was just an athletic activity that he just really took to. He enjoyed a lot. In my Facebook memories today, a conversation that we had about exactly a year ago was, I woke up and I said, do you ever have a dream where you're feeling like you're underwater and everything's in slow motion? She says, oh yeah, I get that feeling every time I fence Eli. My son was the fencer. He was very fast. He was very good. And he couldn't, for the past 5 years, he was unable to beat Eli.
That's just great. That's
strictly
great.
foil, but Lindy went on to saber. And then when the brain tumor started to have symptoms, he fenced with his left hand, and that was the side that was affected by it, and he couldn't control the point anymore, and he had to stop fencing.
That's beautiful.
Yeah,
beautiful.
that was really sad.
That I didn't know about. I was going to ask you about, did he pass it on to his children, or did any of his kids take it up? Because I kind of got into fencing through an adopted father. It's a sport that really lends itself to family and passing it down the line. So
We had a great fencing master who allowed Lindy to teach the little ones.
Yeah.
And Lindy not only taught, but he also did a lot of refereeing, especially for the little kids. You know, when little kids are flailing around like this, and you've got to say what the action was. Okay, there was an attack and a repose, and they were just going like that. It was really very funny. But he enjoyed every minute of fencing.
The way I found out about it is he had this wonderful T-shirt, and it was a T-shirt of, it showed the amphibians coming out of the water, and it had an amoeba, and then it had a frog, and then an alligator, and then a pre-animal, and then another bigger animal, and then it had a monkey and an ape and a Neanderthal, and then at the end of the line was a fencer.
So that was actually the fourth thing that Lindy was. He was also a fencer.
I may close the circle that Izzy opened. I am a person who never met him other than through his teaching his videos online. So I feel like I do have a sense of him, and certainly an enhanced sense from everything that I'm hearing today. I did, on his Understanding Economics course on lesson 1 and 2, actually send him an email. I thought that one of the answers to the multiple choice questions at the end of the segment was not quite correct. So I emailed him about it, and he emailed me back very graciously, suggesting that I had a point, but now that you've told me that he never told anybody that they were wrong. I'll have to take up the discussion again. But really, he did. The legacy is much broader than the people. Second and third. Thank you.
The first time I met Henry, first time I met Lindy was in one of the classrooms in 30th Street, and he was standing behind us, observing us, and he was looking over us and seeing how we were taking notes, and he noticed about me that I have written the questions that were given in the paper. I was writing them on. I wrote them on my notebook and answered them. So he has said, that's a lot. You're doing a lot of work, And ever since then, I always looked at him because how he was open to speak to other people. And the times that I've seen him and had many times seen him with Mike at the school, and they would always have lessons for us as far as how one of the ones that was about the parking lot on 28th Street that they were speaking on, that they were observing for some time, and then had a lesson on it, and and how he was able to teach. And I always respect knowledge and people that are smart. And him writing some of the a book on Africa and things like that made me look up to them more because of what he was able to accomplish, and things that I was trying to work back to be able to do myself. So last year's conference, I knew that he was having a hard time just attending the conference, and but after breakfast, because we both had breakfast in the same area, I was able to hug him. Hoping I could give him the strength to defeat it. So, God bless them. Thank you.
I just recall the first time I met Lindy and the last time I met Lindy. The first time I met Lindy was at one of these CGOs. I can't even remember which city. But I was really annoyed with him. Kai was the speaker and Lindy was the moderator. And Kai was saying things, as many here would agree with him, about socialism and how bad it is and all that. And I wanted from the floor to be able to contradict what Kai was saying. And as usual, we were short of time. It was probably Dan who was winding up the watch. And Lindy said, questions only. And I said, well, that's not fair. I don't want to ask a question. I want to contradict what I've just heard. And after that, we became friends. Later, I became president of the IU, and we used to collaborate on things, only in a minor way, not as close as other people that have already spoken.
What's your question?
And the last time I met Lindy, he came over to London, and I met him at the airport and was taking him to the lodgings. One of the members of the Georgist movement was putting him up, and Heather was with me. We stopped at a little, I was going to say restaurant, it was more of a cafe because I'm not that generous with my money. And we had an English breakfast, you know, the eggs, the bacons, the beans, etc. And the conversation we had on that occasion educated me. We emailed each other since, on occasions, maybe once every 6 months or so, but that was the last time I saw him. And I was gutted when I heard the news. And just one final coincidence,
coincidence. I didn't know until this meeting that he and I shared the same 9th of October birthday, but I share mine with John Lennon.
I'm afraid I didn't know Lindy very well, but I did have the fortunate opportunities to have met him over the years at conferences. He was always there, and I knew he was good friends with Mike, and of course he came to Arden for the education conference we had in Arden, which we organized as the Arden Georges, and he came down to speak very nicely for a celebration we had for Mike a couple years ago. But I'm sorry I didn't get to know him better. But hearing everybody else's comments makes me feel like I knew him. Thanks.
Lindy always wanted to move to Arden, and when I would say, I don't want to leave Maine, one of the things that he would say that was good about moving to Arden is, Sadie Summer who lives here, she's really nice, you really like her.
He said the same about you.
When I would get the
bottom.
Those bloody microphones.
When I would get the Georges Journal, I'd always read all of Lindy's statements first. I would go through each edition and read them first because I was always interested in hearing what he was writing and what he was, opinions he was giving. He also would do the brochures for our CGO conferences. We'd give him the information and he'd turn out beautiful brochures and do wonderful work on the planning committee for the CGO. We're going to miss Lindy, and it's going to be hard to replace all the work that Lindy has been able to do in the Institute. And I wish the Institute the best to try to continue on all the work that he's doing and has done.
One of the perennial Georges discussions is politics versus education. Even started with Henry George himself. And I think of Lindy when somebody tried to embarrass Churchill when he was Prime Minister, said, "You used to sing the land song." And instead of being embarrassed, he said, Churchill said, "I'd sing it again if I had the voters with me." So it bears out that the politics and the education go together.
When we were putting the conference program together, we learned not only that Lindy had passed away, but that it had been a very expensive process to try to save him. And I look at my life and I think, well, I don't have any kids. I don't have a family. It's a little easier for me to be self-sacrificing because everything that I have left over when I'm gone, there's nobody to give it to anyhow, particularly. But Lindy had all these debts related to this. And the question was, well, can we give him, can the CGO make a donation? And my feeling was, well, it's not appropriate for the CGO to do that because our money is organizational money. It's like not our money, it's somebody else's money. But we can have this event. And by having this event, we can, we were able to pay for Lisa to come out because that's of great value to everybody here. And so it's the charge of putting on the best possible conference in this case is to have this tribute to Lindy. And I'm hoping that other people will be inspired to contribute to help Lisa recover from his debts. And so that's part of the thinking that went into having this kind of an approach rather than giving him money, because institutional money that is meaningless, personal money is love. So that's...
Okay, we done?
Well, George will close. You have closing remarks, I assume?
Well,
Excuse us, one moment. If nobody has anything else to say about the deceased, Mark would like to say a few words about the single tax.
All right, this will take about a half hour.
Nothing else need be said. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.